I have a scripture for you today, and I have some questions for you today. And the good news is you have an answer to all these questions. We'll somehow have to dig it out, but you have an answer, I think. Let me start with a scripture. It comes from Psalm 139. And maybe you're familiar with that one, that it starts out, "O Eternal One, you have explored my heart and know exactly who I am." Do you remember that scripture? It goes on down the next 12 verses, and it talks about how God is so very, very, very close. We don't think this was written by David as a psalm, but it might have been. But it goes down and explains how close God is, how much God knows about this writer, this psalmist, that everywhere it's probably a he in this case, goes, God knows that's where he is. Whatever he's getting ready to say, God knows he's getting ready to say it. There's no distance. Now, some writers will say that's scary. And if it is David, if you remember, he's crossed over the line quite a few times, and he's maybe thinking to himself, "Ooh, can I get by with this one? No, probably can't. God's right here." But it's really not a threat. It's really not a threat. It's more of a statement, an affirmation of comfort, of God being so much in our lives, so very present. It goes on down a little bit further, and it talks about how God has hemmed us in the front, in the back, on the side. The word hem not meaning like being in a cage, but being surrounded with love and support. I remember a number of years ago I saw a photograph of a man's hand. It was really a big hand. Calloused. You could tell this was a hand of a worker, but a really big hand. And in this hand, maybe you've seen this somewhere along the line, he was holding an infant, maybe a newborn. And it was just fantastic to see, just amazing to see how this baby, this little baby, was being cradled in this one hand. And the baby looked like he or she totally gone, totally. Have you ever done that? I know some of you have fairly recently, Michelle and Linda, held an infant in your arms and cradled them. And they are hemmed in the front, in the side, in the back. And there comes that moment, you know this moment, when this little fidgety body all of a sudden gets very still and just kind of sinks into those loving arms of yours. I think that's what the psalmist was talking about. That's how he felt that God was holding him. Even in the knuckle-headed things that he would do, even those times when he had turned his back on God, even in those times when he wasn't real sure what the next step was going to be, he knew that God was holding him. The Psalm 139 creates this image of our relationship with God, and then he closes it out, the psalmist. He closes it out with verse 13 and 14. I want to read those to you. "For you shaped me, even my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I will offer you my grateful heart, for I am your unique creation, filled with wonder and awe. Your works are wonderful. I carry this knowledge deep within my soul." Did you catch some of the imagery on that part? Now, there's something interesting here you may or may not be aware of. The Hebrew understanding, the classical understanding, was that the heart, whenever the heart is mentioned, that's the mind. That's where they think. The inward parts, if you take this back to its original word, means kidneys. The kidneys were the center of emotions, of feeling. To some degree that still exists today. Have you ever heard anybody say, well, I have a gut feeling about such and such? It could be a good feeling, it could be a bad feeling, but I have a gut feeling. So the psalmist is saying that God had created, shaped him, even the way that he felt about things, his emotions. And he's grateful because he understands that he has been uniquely created as well as wonderfully made. What do you do with that? I read that and I think about it and I come up with this question for me of, what does it mean? What does it really mean that I'm wonderfully made? What does it mean? What does it really mean that I'm uniquely created? What do I look like? What does that mean in my life? How will I live that way? A few weeks ago, I came across a fascinating interview. It was on The Daily Show, online. And it featured two women, Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. Anybody know Tarana Burke? You might. She grew up in Brooklyn. As a child, as an adolescent, she was sexually abused. She survived, but it left her marks, no doubt. She ended up graduating from Auburn University. She moved back, and she created a nonprofit because she had experienced so much that she knew that there were many, many, many other women like her that had experienced the same, and so she wanted to help them in their trauma, in their drama, in their concerns and sorrows and pain. She started something called Me Too. That was in 2006. Long before it ever became a popular movement in 2017. In 2017, as you remember, Time magazine named Me Too the Person of the Year. Tarana Burke started that. Brene Brown, some of you know her. She's written a lot, researched a lot, made incredible videos, become very popular because, well, she just seems to hit the core when talking about shame and vulnerability and relationships. And she and Tarana became friends. Over the years, not only did they work on projects together, but they became friends. One day, Tarana calls Brene and says, hey, can we talk? Brene says, well, sure, yeah. As far as Brene knew, there was no agenda, no continuing project. She just assumed they were going to talk about family, friends, decoration, who knows what, just a nice, casual conversation. Tarana starts out by saying, I don't know that I understand what you're trying to get at on your books. I don't understand because I'm a black woman. And you are starting from a whole different perspective, a whole different level. When you talk about getting past shame, getting past vulnerability, and so it's a good thing, I can't do that as a black woman living in America. I can't do that. Brene's response, I'm struggling with that too. Because I know that all the research that I've done over the last 25 years with all diverse cultures, I still find myself responding from where I am as a white woman, privileged. And Brene immediately understood that, yeah, they were both dealing with the same problem, if you will. Tarana and Brene decided we need to do something about this. And so together they created a book. You Are Your Best Thing. Vulnerability, Shame Resistance, and the Black Experience. And they invited people to share their stories. This is not a textbook, but to share their stories of what it meant for them in their life, what their life experiences had done to them. They got together after a while. They were reading some of the stories, and Tarana and Brene said, "What'd you find?" Tarana, a black woman, said, "I'm finding out what it means to be black." The stories were so unique. The stories were so penetrating. The stories were so compelling. She realized that she did what a lot of us do, that we make a category. Black people are this. Brene Brown said the same thing. I've been blown away by these stories because she realized that she did the same thing to white people. White people are this. It's easier that way. When we categorize whatever group of the population it is, it's easier to categorize, well, this is what they would think. This is what they would do. This is how they would feel. And these stories hit so hard about, no, each person has an individual, unique story. And unless you're willing to hear that story and take it from where they are, not where you think they are, not where you assume they are, but where they actually are, you're not hearing their story. The interviewer asked Brene, "How do you earn the right to hear these stories?" Because they were so open, they were so individual, they were so personal. And she started talking about vulnerability is a gift to be given, and she went on a little bit and then she stopped. And you could tell that in her mind she was thinking something through. And like she hit a reset button, and she said, "I've come up with a question that I have to ask. What story do you have to say to yourself to be okay with what you see happening? What story, what narrative do you have to say to yourself for you to be okay with what's happening?" The interviewer just stopped. Tarana just stopped. And you could see that this story was something that just cut deep, in a good way, that got to the core issue about what is it that we do. Because we all have narratives. We all have stories that kind of tell us about our lives. Sometimes they're called tapes, where whatever the tape is, whatever's happening out there, we run it through the tape. And that's how we perceive it. That's the filter by which we understand what life really is about. But the story, Brene was asking, what story do you have to come up with for you to be okay? You see, I started thinking about that, and I have to admit, I have to confess, that sometimes my story, just to keep my perceived sanity, when I hear and see what's going on, I have to come up with an escape clause somehow, my story. It's too big for me. I can't really make an impact on that. It's too deep for me. I don't have the skills. I don't have the knowledge. I don't have the amount of energy it would take to handle this. I've got to somehow sweep it off my plate, because if I don't, how do you deal with something like that? How do you deal with, when you look around the world and see what all's going on, how do you deal with it? You might say it was a showstopper, because it really hit home. So what is our story? What is our story about what we have to say to ourselves to be okay with what's going on? Well, let me share with you this story that we have as United Christian Church. And this is a story. This is a narrative. Remember these words. It's in our Constitution and bylaws. It proclaims this is how we are, this is who we are, to bear witness to the abundant love of God as evidenced in the life and teachings of Jesus by extending radical hospitality and seeking justice as a faith community. Those are good words. And it goes on. To actively participate in the transforming ministry of Jesus in the world by, and now we start getting specific, affirming the presence of God in all persons, supporting all people in their search for truth and meaning, encouraging spiritual practices that lead to wholeness, building a caring community that pursues peace through justice, being a good steward of God's creation. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this story. It covers all the bases. It says whatever is going out there, we're going to look at it through these filters. It's a great story. But what on earth does it mean? What does that mean in the way that we are going to lead our individual lives, our day-to-day lives? What does it mean? How are we going to get through this? You see, Brené's question, I think, only got us halfway there. She asked, what story did we have? She didn't ask, how do you live out your story? What do you do to make your story come alive? It is difficult to come up with a story, a narrative that, on black and white paper right here, it pronounces, it declares, this is what we're going to be about. But it's a different ball game to try to figure out, so how are we going to make this happen? Well, maybe that's exactly what the psalmist was talking about. Talking about how we are unique creations, how we are wonderfully made. Hint, hint, jab, jab. This is how you do it. By understanding that we as individuals, being unique, one size does not fit all. And whenever we hear an agenda of this is what we need to do, that might be good for somebody else, but we need to own our own agenda, our own schedule. What kind of skills, what kind of gift, what kind of energy, what kind of resources, what kind of everything do I have to be able to reach out and make a difference? And it may not fit somebody else's story and their approach. I think that's what the psalmist was talking about here, that we need to claim our own path. We need to declare our own intention, commitment, that we will find what it is that we can offer and do that. Well, just about that same time, I came across something that Carrie Newcomer had written in one of her recent poems. I've introduced Carrie Newcomer to you a few times, both in music and her writing. She's the Quaker woman who just hits the nail every single time. Just has the way, whatever I'm feeling, quite often she understands, but she can put words to it. So she wrote a poem a while back. What you won't hear on cable news. I'd like to share that with you this morning. I want to tell you what you won't hear on cable news. About a young woman in the airport who is so exhausted and harried by hours of delay and wrangling an overtired toddler that when her little boy finally and completely melted down and planted himself on the floor, she sat down beside him and started to cry. I want to tell you about 5 random women who immediately flowed in from all directions. One pulled out a little toy from her purse. One offered a snack or to go get something to drink. One who called the child honey, wiped his nose with a tissue, and offered another one to the grateful mother. And the one who asked if it was all right to walk hand in hand with the child right there at the gate, close by and always, always in sight. I want to tell you about a man who makes soup and bread and then gives it away, and the nurse who held his hand when he was breathless and afraid. I want to tell you about my neighbor who drives around all winter with snow chains in his car just in case someone needs help. I want to tell you about all the people I meet who keep extending themselves and braving the risk of being told it's none of their business, who offer a hand or a bit of encouragement or a couple of bucks, who will walk a fussy child around the gate because it is the kind thing to do. I want to tell you the world still turns every single day on an axis of goodness and unexpected grace that shows up without fanfare and often where we least expect to find it. We are in that story. That story is within us. Because this is who we are. Created as unique individuals and wonderfully made. This is who we are. And your answer to these questions, it's up to you. It's always up to you. Amen.